Welcome back to another edition of Between Two FARS. I'm Warnicki Miller here once again with our veteran procurement attorney, Robert Tepfer. And today, Bob is going to talk to us a little bit about the purpose and the importance of contract memorandums for record. Bob, what is a contract memorandum for record and why do we use them?
Okay, it's notes explaining, the basis for a decision that you made at some juncture in the contract. And too often I did this because of whatever, or this particular fact or this particular conversation. And then this is what I did. A failure to explain the logic, I wouldn't say it comes back to haunt you, but it really is, you're doing yourself a disservice, because a whole lot of people pick up that file, including other contract specialists and contracting officers. And the decision that you make is going to be very much dependent upon the particular facts at that moment in time. And you're going to have gone through a lot of different options applying those facts, and nobody will know necessarily what those options were and why you eliminated them based upon the particular facts that you had, unless you make a record. Imagine we had a pandemic and there were all sorts of bad things going on. Well, that's fine and everything, and most people will remember the events that we're currently living. But in 18 months to 2 years, they might not understand kind of the consequence of those events and the options that they eliminated, unless you speak to them and apply them. Now you say, who will care? The decision will be made. And the issue will be one that perhaps an IG auditor may be going through, may not understand how the facts of your particular contract are impacted by other contracts at the center, or services that the center can provide, or maybe the availability of contractors and options that you had, unless you take the time to record that.
So and you're capturing your thought process at that moment in time. It's not just the facts and the prevailing law or contract terms or FAR provisions. It's also the contracting officer's thought process that's bridging those facts to the law or the governing regulation? Yes,
absolutely. And if you do it right, it almost should be silly, because it's going to be like anybody can tell, but that might not be the case in 18 months to 2 years. And they will perhaps apply the facts that they remember on their circumstance, or maybe the situation and circumstances at their point in time, none of which will be appropriate in light of what you're living when you make that decision. It's very important to note that, because I always tell people to tell a very comprehensive story, because you have various readers that could be involved in it. And like if it's a GAO issue, you want them to understand you made this decision, and you don't just give them the final decision. You go over the options you had and why this particular option was the best. To do that, quite often you have to go into detail, examining the other options and speaking to those facts at the time and why it's not appropriate to choose that option. And you almost kind of, on the paper, throw up your hands and say, look, this isn't perfect. It's not what I would have liked, but it's the best that I could do under these circumstances. Saving money, getting the services that we had to have to prevent subsequent expenditures of money, and you explain all of that. If you don't, people will not know, and you could very well end up with an embarrassing situation where they don't calculate that in, and realistically, anybody responsible would have at the time.
Yeah, you don't want to judge whether it's in front of the GAO or in front of the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. Anytime you're in litigation, you don't want the adjudicator to be coming up with a better idea than what you captured in your memorandum for the record. But generally, I found that they will allow the contracting officer to exercise his or her discretion, so long as there is evidence that discretion was exercised. If it's just sort of a narrative of this is the fact and this is what I did, and the end, a short little thing. It doesn't show that you exercised your discretion. It almost seems like point A to point B to point C, no thought went into it. But as Bob is saying, if you allow your own internal wrestlings with, well, we considered this option, but we decided not to go this route because of A, B, or C, and you lay that out, that shows that you exercised your discretion, and that can make all the difference in the world in litigation, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you struggle with it, and it almost has to have a tone of what would you have done?
Yes.
You know, surely, you know, in a vacuum, this seems like the reasonable thing. But when you look at the few contractors we had and the impact it was going to have on other contracts, this simply wasn't realistic to go to that normal circumstance and normal option. It just wasn't going to work. Also, and we talked about earlier, that if you're talking to the contractor and the contractor has made certain representations to you, certain interpretations that, you know, you're living with, quite often they can get legal counsel involved, and a lawyer can say, well, you know, if you made the decision based on A, B, or C, that would be okay. And although they were going with J and K at the time, they may all of a sudden very conveniently move their, you know, logic and interpretation over to that other area. But if you have contemporaneous documentation where they spoke to a particular issue, said it a certain way, it's dated way back in June, you know, and you relied on it, then, you know, for them to change their story, it's not too cool on their part, and you look much better. Your conduct is very reasonable. The biggest headache that I find is that a lot of contract officers, you know, want to throw up their hands and say, look, I put in a few sentences, I put in a paragraph on this, and you want me to, you know, write the entire book. And the answer is, I'm doing it to protect you, because you're going to be scrutinized as to why you made this decision and why you did these things. And if you explain it, I think it's very logical. But if you don't, it's going to be looking very flippant, like, well, you know, we went ahead and did this.
Yes. Whether it's an auditor looking at your memorandum for the record, you want them to walk away with the impression that, oh, well, obviously that's the choice they went with. There was no other viable alternative.
Exactly.
But a little bit about the administrative benefits of a memorandum for record in terms of personnel turnover on a contract.
Okay. If you're working a big contract, one of these big program office contracts, I mean, they can go on for like 10 years, okay? Regardless, you know, they'll get extensions. Maybe it'll be a different contract of sorts, but it's not really, okay? People need to be able to pick up and understand the whole story. They need to have continuity. They need to be able to see courses of conduct as to how people have interpreted provisions and why they interpret them, why it was advantageous at the time, and it still is, okay, for purposes of consistency and efficiency. If you don't explain things, if you don't educate, the contracting officer who shows up in 3 years won't be able to have the benefit of your experience, and it's no fun to go back and relearn everything.
Yes. Well, as you can tell, memorandums for the record are vital for a number of reasons. We hope this has helped you to understand why the attorneys are always on your case to document, document, document. Until next time, we'll see you back here at Between Two FARS.